I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Ron and Sarah, and thank you so much to Mayor Harmon. I was at the dinner last night and was so inspired by the stories of San Luis Obispo and Santa Fe and Austin and the leadership coming out of those cities on these issues. I'm really grateful to be here on this day, this Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But many of you are probably asking yourselves, what on earth is a civil rights lawyer doing here? What does her work have to do with the work of innovation and excellence in green building? There is an immediately apparent nexus that keeps getting brought up, and that all of you, I'm sure, have considered your work innovating, engineering, and building to give us a more sustainable future is essential to allowing humanity to adapt to climate change and to hopefully moderating its terrifying trajectory. It has been so well documented that those with the fewest resources, those who are the least able to adapt, are bearing the most grossly disproportionate share of the effects of climate change, both here in the United States and globally. Just last week, NPR reported on research linking housing discrimination with the physical temperature in neighborhoods across the United States. The findings are that neighborhoods with higher temperatures are also those that were subjected to discriminatory race-based housing practices nearly a century ago. That practice was known as redlining. And mortgage lenders used ratings and maps that were developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation that identified neighborhoods that they considered risky or hazardous. I'll give you 3 guesses. Who lived in those neighborhoods then and who still lives in those neighborhoods now? It's quite clear that the practice of redlining concentrated poverty and stifled home ownership for racial and ethnic minorities with enduring effects all across the US. Low-income areas in the most populous 97 American countries are more likely to be hotter than wealthy neighborhoods in those same cities. Those lower income areas are, because of redlining, almost always disproportionately communities of color. Those neighborhoods that were deemed risky or hazardous in the 1930s are hotter than higher rated, wealthier neighborhoods in the same cities by nearly 5 degrees on average across the United States. And in some cities, that number is more like 10 or 12 degrees. When I read that research, I thought to myself, I live in Washington, D.C., where the summers are awful already. What is it like to live in those neighborhoods in a Washington, D.C. summer? Who suffers the most? Who bears those burdens? And what does climate change mean for those neighborhoods? The connection between our built environments, including where we live, and discrimination is tangible. And the connection between addressing climate change and adapting to its effects and furthering social justice and equity is a crucial one. There is an immediate connection between your daily work and that effort, provided that you bring it into focus. And I'm so glad that Rihanna Gunn Knight will be here to talk about the Green New Deal later today. I think that's such a central part of that conversation. In these times of legitimate crisis, I think it can be tempting to think only about what we need to do, prioritizing the what over the how we do the work, how we address the crisis. When stories of fires in Australia or the Amazon or California are in the daily news cycle, and followed by or preceded by more frequent and more severe hurricanes or drought, I understand this temptation. We don't have time to worry about the how. But I'm here to challenge that, to suggest to you, those who are engaged daily in this work, that the means matter a great deal for those who see themselves as doing work that serves society. On this Martin Luther King Day, I think Dr. King's writings and teachings and philosophy offer powerful insights about how you go about your work, not the what, but the how. I've spoken on this theme with nonprofits, especially in the legal community, advocacy organizations, who see themselves often accurately as the good guys, as doing righteous work, providing a voice and counsel for those without, for the powerless. And the theme is relevant to you too. If I had to guess, I would say that most of you are here both because green home building is your livelihood, but also because you believe that your work makes the world and our communities better by creating a pathway to greater harmony with the natural environment, by constructing livable and walkable communities, by innovating with climate change in mind. I'd guess that you think of yourselves as good guys. Dr. King's teachings offer us another frame on what that means. He focuses on the what, but also on the how. In shorthand, I would say Dr. King advocates for walking the walk. In my legal practice, most of the time, my work is about representing victims of discrimination. My job is to help make things right for women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community, and others who have been treated unfairly at work or perhaps in their housing circumstances. I work to secure relief for victims of discrimination, but also to fix the systems and the processes that gave rise to that underlying discrimination, to attack the root causes of it. The overwhelming majority of my clients work at major corporations and ultimately decide to bring a lawsuit because the problem persists or because they just can't take it anymore. They're fired or underpaid or passed over for promotions. They face harassment. And then when they decide to come forward, they face stigma and scrutiny and so many other hardships. Those hardships really underscore for me how bad it must have been for them in their work to decide to come forward. My work on behalf of women who are employed at Sterling Jewelers, which is the parent company of Jared and Kay, and women employees at AT&T mobility stores are examples of that kind of work where we allege that the pay-setting practices discriminate against women or that attendance policies have a disproportionate effect on pregnant workers. But occasionally, more recently, in the wake of the resurgence of the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, I've been approached by women and people of color who work in progressive social justice-oriented organizations or for companies who are widely seen as leading the way with family-friendly practices or robust diversity and inclusion policies. I have to be careful here not to speak with too much specificity to protect my clients, but I do want to try and offer a little bit more about what I'm talking about here. For example, what happens when organizers, and activists, and lawyers at a well-known civil rights organization describe race and gender discrimination that's widespread and pervasive sexual harassment, at least some of which the leadership of the organization was aware of for years? Or when law firms or legal nonprofits whose members have sworn to uphold the laws of the United States engage in patterns of discrimination against women and people of color? When activists and lawyers from a well-known civil rights organization first came to me and shared their stories, I thought, can this possibly be true? How can this be happening at such a well-known organization committed to justice? But these individuals are deeply credible in their own right, and our investigation of their stories substantiated and confirmed what they said. Dozens of witness interviews. I believe them. But their allegations in our investigation really rocked me to my core. While I was in the midst of that investigation, I'd come home just physically depleted, emotionally drained. My work is hard, just generally. If you look at the news stories about the Sterling Jewelers case or press coverage of the inclusion rider, you can see that I contend daily with the realities of systemic discrimination. So why did this investigation into discrimination and harassment at a civil rights organization, why did it so deeply unsettle me? I've reflected on that at some length, and it's brought me to the writings of Dr. King and to you. He wrote so much and taught so much that there's a wealth of material, but I've focused on a few. His letter from Birmingham jail, which was written to white religious leaders in August 1963 while he was imprisoned for participating in civil disobedience in Birmingham, and was the subject of criticism for that civil disobedience. An address that he delivered at Illinois Wesleyan University in 1966, and his final Christmas sermon delivered on December 24th, 1967, just 4 months before his assassination. If you haven't read those documents, go read them. And if you haven't read them recently, go back and read them again. Dr. King was remarkably consistent in preaching and teaching in the civil rights movement of nonviolent disobedience, that, and this is a quote from his letter from Birmingham jail, "Nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek." He develops this principle a little bit further in his Christmas sermon, beginning from the insight that all life is interrelated, and proceeding to contend that, and this is another quote, "If we are to have peace in the world, men and nations must embrace the nonviolent affirmation that ends and means must cohere." Why? He dismantles the contrary position that as long as you get to the right end, the means don't matter. He says, "We will never have peace in the world until men everywhere recognize that ends are not cut off from means. Means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. And ultimately, you can't reach good ends through evil means because the means represent the seed and the end represents the tree." If any of you come from a nonprofit or advocacy background, you may have wrestled with this issue. It comes up all the time. For example, should an organization accept funding from a company or an industry whose work is fundamentally inconsistent with the work of that organization, but where the funding will advance good, important, even necessary work? It's certainly a tricky question. And perhaps the answer lies somewhere along a continuum, weighing how morally repugnant that work is, or how urgent or important the organization's work is. But I don't think we need to fixate on extremes to explore the applicability of Dr. King's teachings to the work of you all and the civil rights organization where my clients worked. Far be it from me to question Dr. King's moral authority, so let's just start from the premise that he's right, that using moral and just means is the right thing to do. I want to suggest to you that aligning means and ends using just means to accomplish worthy ends is also the pragmatic thing to do. It's the path that will lead most effectively to the righteous ends we seek and will permit those accomplishments to endure. Let me give you a couple examples of what I think. My husband and I were chatting last week about the message I wanted to convey to you all today, and he offered the following example, which I think is spot on. There are some on either end of the political spectrum who would say, just focus on getting the members of our political party elected into power, in control. Don't worry about how. Don't worry about manipulation or lies. Don't worry about polarizing the American electorate or stoking fear. Just focus on our base. It doesn't matter if that approach results in America where people of different views can't talk to each other anymore. Just get us into power so we can press forward our policy agenda. As we watch the energy efficiency gains and the climate change policy progress of the last administration systematically reversed, one lesson we might draw is that under such a polarized framework, in such a polarized America, policy gains are only as enduring as the next election cycle. The progress is short-lived. I, like you, I'm sure, have plenty to say on who or what is responsible for that polarization, but I'll spare you my unsolicited political views and return to Dr. King's teachings, which suggest to us that the how matters to achieving the what. Politics that seek common ground, that operate from a foundation in truth, and strive for the healing of our polity are more likely to lead to more enduring progress on the important issues that we all care about. Here's another example from the workplace context, which is much more in my wheelhouse. When an organization or a company ostensibly committed to socially responsible business practices, or directly in the work, say civil rights or poverty alleviation, environmental issues or climate change, pick your issue, if they only apply those values in their outward-facing work and fail to implement those values in their own house, their work suffers. I've seen it happen. Staff grow cynical, and their inspiration and their motivation seep away. They come to see their employer's commitment to these issues as self-serving or perhaps superficial, and eventually these companies, these organizations who are not walking the walk, they lose talented people, sometimes in a hemorrhage, which is then further demoralizing, further destabilizing. Staff leave, taking with them skills, training, institutional knowledge. Others might challenge the legality of the company's practices, whether internally through organizing or externally in the press or even legal action. And no matter what, the substance of that righteous and necessary work, it slows down. Sometimes it grinds to a halt. Look, there are lots of different kinds of workplace problems. Sometimes it's companies who don't pay their workers fairly, skirting overtime laws, or paying women or people of color less. Sometimes the problem is promoting people with a tap on the shoulder rather than identifying who's actually most qualified for the job. Or perhaps the issue is allowing unconscious bias or stereotypes to creep into evaluating employee performance. Or the problem might be, as we've seen in Silicon Valley, in tech more broadly, in media and entertainment, that a company protects its most valuable senior employees, shielding them from accountability for sexual harassment or other improper behavior. In most circumstances, in my experience, discrimination is not intentional. It's a function of assumptions that are thought to be neutral but that play out in discriminatory ways, but that's not always the case. I've seen plenty of examples of companies, boards, and leadership who know that they're treating their employees unfairly. My position here for you all is to ask you to think about yourselves not just as champions of the fight for sustainability, but also as companies, as workers, as employers. And to keep in mind that your internal practices, the means, if they devalue and diminish workers, even unintentionally, can be short-sighted and undermine your long-term success. Even for the most pragmatic among us, the means should matter. I'll never forget something that my sister once said to me. She's a pediatric surgeon. I was under the gun, facing a court-ordered deadline to file a brief, and I was really working to crystallize my argument, to put my client's best argument forward. What I'm about to say, she learned from a surgical mentor of hers, so neither she nor I can take any credit for it, except that I try to live it in my practice. That surgeon said to my sister, who repeated to me, "I am in a hurry, so I'm going very slowly." I offer it as a mantra to my staff when we're under deadline: get it right the first time, so we don't have to go back and do it again. The same principle, I think, applies in the longer term, too. So much better to do the work correctly, to use the correct means the first time, given the urgency of that work. Another way to say it might be, don't cut corners. Part of what I'm offering here is the business case for building diversity and implementing progressive workplace policies. As might be expected, my initial engagement with these issues came from a legal perspective. A few years ago, leaders from about 45 leading American companies, including a bunch of Fortune 100 companies, filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court. The case was Fisher versus the University of Texas. An amicus brief is like a friend of the court brief, where interested parties tell the court their position on the issues in front of them, even if they are not directly in the case. Fisher versus University of Texas was the most recent major Supreme Court case to wrestle with the question of what role diversity should play in higher education admissions. And this Fisher brief from the business community documented the business and economic imperative, that's the language used, of maintaining the ability of colleges and universities to consider diversity in making admissions decisions as part of an individualized and holistic process. The signers to that brief describe hiring processes that simultaneously seek out the most qualified group of candidates and take into account how diversity strengthens the workplace. One study, so underlying that brief, and you can go find it. It's out there. Underlying that amicus brief is the robust and growing body of evidence that companies committed to diversity are more successful on the most conventional terms. One study from 2009 reports that the commitment to diversity is accompanied by increased sales, greater revenues, more customers, greater market share, and relative profits. A 2018 study from the Boston Consulting Group documents how companies with more diverse management teams have revenues that are nearly 20% higher than companies with less diverse management teams. And that value of workplace diversity extends into the C-suite. A 2015 study shows a statistically significant connection between companies with women and minorities in their upper ranks and financial performance. Look, workplaces with rich diversity among their employees are more resilient and they're more creative. They outperform organizations along the most conventional metrics that don't invest in diversity. True commitment to diversity fosters stronger connections with customers and clients and greater innovation. That connection between innovation, creativity, resilience, and workplace diversity is one with particular relevance to industries like yours that have to stay on the cutting edge in light of the urgency of the issues that you all tackle. All of this research supports the proposition that I consider increasingly obvious that as the face of America grows more diverse, so too must our workforce and the leadership of that workforce, and there's no doubt that nearly all industry has work to do. McKinsey publishes an annual survey on women in the workplace. In its most recent report, it documents how across American industry, women, particularly women of color, remain underrepresented in positions of leadership or authority. And that's not even to mention the deeply compelling stories of blue-collar and low-wage workers. Which brings me to a central point I want to leave you with, kind of a cautionary note, really. In recent months and years, the term diversity and inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion have become buzzwords. They often describe superficial efforts to use in marketing strategies. And I want to tell you, as you reflect on your own practices, that it's not enough just to improve your hiring practices so that your workplaces look more diverse, although that's certainly a start. To truly walk the walk, to align your means and your ends, to develop companies that live their values internally and externally. Building diverse workplaces is certainly important, but you have to go one step farther. The value placed on that diversity, it has to transcend the superficial. Fair workplace practices must extend to creating a genuinely respectful workplace culture, fair and equal pay and evaluations and promotions, accommodations and leave for pregnancy, caregiving, disabilities. In other words, workplaces must truly value workers. Back to my clients from that civil rights organization I was talking about earlier, I now understand better why I was so rocked initially by hearing their stories, by what they'd been subjected to and the organization's response to their claims. It spoke of such cynicism, such a superficial commitment to the work. And consistent with my experience, I've watched that organization struggle to put its important work first, hamstrung by internal upheaval that flowed directly from its failure to apply its stated values internally. I was speaking with that organization's lawyer who said to me something like, We really want to resolve your clients' issues so that we can get back to doing the work that really matters. My response to her was that addressing systemic discrimination and harassment, rooting it out, making things right for my clients and other employees of that organization, that is the work that really matters. I want to leave you with one final observation from Dr. King, which was recorded in his handwritten notes from a speech that he delivered in 1960 to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Those notes read, "Nonviolence is the relentless pursuit of truthful ends through moral means." Relentlessness is one of my favorite words. It speaks to grit and fight and stamina. You surely need all of those qualities to do the work you are engaged in. I know I need them in mine. Dr. King's insight here is a little meta, as I think the kids would say these days. Not only must you align your means with your ends, but you must do so in a way that is persistent, unflagging, and disciplined. Your commitment to green building practices, innovation, and excellence, it needs that relentlessness. And so does your commitment to pursue that work in a just, ethical, and moral way. I hope you'll leave here with a commitment to look inside a little bit, to examine your practices and your way in the world with Dr. King's teachings in mind. I thank you all for the work you're doing to make our world a more sustainable and healthier place. Thanks so much.